The bullet whistled past Flora Vance's ear close enough that she felt the heat of it, and she dropped flat behind the granite outcropping with her rifle clutched tight against her chest. Sacramento had seemed like the perfect place to start fresh when she arrived 3 years ago in 1881, but the valley stretching north of the California town had become her battlefield, and she was losing ground every single day. The poachers had grown bolder, slaughtering elk and deer by the dozens, taking only the choicest cuts and leaving the rest to rot under the merciless sun. She had reported them to the sheriff countless times, but he claimed his jurisdiction ended where the wilderness began, and the federal marshals were spread too thin across the territories to care about dead animals. Flora pressed her cheek against the cool stone and tried to slow her breathing. There were 3 of them this time, maybe 4, and she had seen their camp just after dawn. They had killed 6 elk overnight, butchered them carelessly, and were packing the meat onto mules when she made the mistake of stepping on a dry branch. Now they were hunting her instead, and her single repeater rifle felt inadequate against their numbers. "Come on out, girl," a voice called from somewhere to her left. "We ain't gonna hurt you none. Just want to have a conversation about you minding your own business." Flora knew better than to believe that. 2 months ago, they had caught one of her tracking markers and left a dead crow nailed to a tree with a note warning her to stay away. Last month, they had burned down the small cabin she used as a supply station near Elk Ridge. They knew who she was, knew she lived alone on the property her father had left her, and knew that nobody in Sacramento would lift a finger if she disappeared into the wilderness. She checked her ammunition. 8 rounds left. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but maybe enough to make them think twice about rushing her position. The sun was climbing higher, turning the September morning hot and bright, and sweat trickled down her spine beneath her cotton shirt. She had dressed practical as always, men's trousers and boots that could handle the rough terrain, her dark blonde hair tied back in a braid that hung to her waist. At 24, she had spent more time in these hills than most of the men in Sacramento, and she knew every game trail and water source for 20 miles in any direction. A shadow moved between the pine trees downslope, and Flora fired without hesitation. The crack of her rifle echoed off the surrounding peaks, and someone cursed loudly. She had not hit anyone, but she had made them cautious, and that bought her time. She scrambled backward, using the rocks for cover, working her way toward the dense forest that crowned the ridgeline. If she could reach the trees, she could disappear, and these men were not skilled enough trackers to follow her through the undergrowth. Another shot rang out, and this time the bullet sparked off the granite inches from her hand. Flora flinched and kept moving, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her ribs. She could hear them spreading out now, trying to flank her position, and she knew she had only minutes before they cut off her escape route. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats, coming fast from the north, and a shout that did not belong to any of the poachers. Flora risked a glance over the rocks and saw a rider coming down the slope at a reckless gallop, his horse sending stones skittering in all directions. He wore a dusty brown hat pulled low, and she caught the glint of metal on his chest that might have been a badge or might have been a belt buckle catching the light. "Federal Marshal," the rider bellowed, his voice carrying across the hillside like thunder. "Drop your weapons and show yourselves." The poachers hesitated for only a moment. Then Flora heard the crash of brush as they ran. The rider did not pursue them immediately. Instead, he guided his horse up to Flora's position with surprising precision, swinging down from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped. He was tall and lean, maybe 30 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and gray eyes that took in everything about her situation in a single sweep. "You hit?" he asked, his voice gentler than the shout he had used moments before. "No," Flora said, getting to her feet and brushing dust from her trousers. "But thank you. They would have had me cornered in another minute." The man studied her face, then nodded once. "I am Marshal Bennett Kane. I have been tracking that particular group of poachers for 3 weeks now, ever since they crossed into California from Nevada. Heard rifle fire and figured I had finally caught up with them." "Flora Vance," she said, extending her hand the way her father had taught her, firm and direct. "I have been trying to stop them for months. Nobody in Sacramento would help." Bennett shook her hand, and she noticed the calluses on his palms, the kind that came from years of hard riding and harder work. "That is because they have been moving between territories, hitting an area hard and then disappearing before anyone can organize a response. They are smart, I will give them that, but they are also getting greedy. Greed makes people careless." Flora found herself liking the way he talked, straightforward and honest, without the condescension most men used when they spoke to her. "I have been mapping their camps and trying to predict where they will strike next. I have 3 months of notes back at my ranch if you want to see them." Something shifted in Bennett's expression, a flicker of respect that warmed Flora more than the climbing sun. "I would appreciate that very much, Miss Vance. Most people just complain about poachers. You are the first person I have met who is actually doing something about it." "They are destroying everything my father worked to protect," Flora said, and she heard the edge in her own voice. "He bought this land because he believed the wilderness had value beyond what you could sell or slaughter. When he died 2 years ago, I promised myself I would continue his work, no matter what it cost." Bennett's gray eyes softened slightly. "That is admirable. Also dangerous, if this morning is any indication. These men have killed before, Miss Vance. We found 2 bodies in Nevada, prospectors who probably stumbled onto their operation at the wrong time." Flora felt a chill despite the heat. She had known the poachers were ruthless, but murder was a different threshold entirely. "All the more reason to stop them," she said firmly. "And please call me Flora. Miss Vance makes me feel like a schoolteacher." The corner of Bennett's mouth twitched, not quite a smile but close. "Then you should call me Bennett. Marshal Kane makes me feel older than I am." He glanced back down the slope where the poachers had fled. "They will not go far. They have too much invested in this area, too many caches of meat and supplies hidden in the valleys. If your maps are as detailed as you say, we might be able to set a trap." "We?" Flora asked, unable to keep the hope from her voice. "We," Bennett confirmed. "I could use someone who knows this terrain, and you clearly cannot keep fighting them alone. That is a partnership that makes sense, assuming you are willing to take the risk." Flora thought about the lonely months, the fear that woke her in the night, the weight of fighting a battle nobody else seemed to care about. She thought about her father's grave on the hill behind her ranch house, and the promise she had whispered to the freshly turned earth. "I am willing," she said. They rode back to Flora's ranch together, Bennett's horse keeping an easy pace beside her own mare. The ranch sat in a sheltered valley, 10 miles north of Sacramento. A sturdy log house her father had built with his own hands, a small barn and corrals that currently held only her 2 horses and a milk cow. The property was beautiful in its simplicity, with a creek running clear and cold along the eastern boundary and meadows that turned gold in the autumn light. Bennett dismounted and looked around with evident appreciation. "This is good land," he said. "Your father chose well." "He always said that beauty and practicality were not mutually exclusive," Flora replied, leading him into the house. The interior was neat but sparse, furnished with handmade pieces and lacking the decorative touches most women favored. Flora had never seen the point of frills and fanciness when nobody visited, except the occasional supply merchant from Sacramento. She spread her maps across the kitchen table. 3 months of careful observations rendered in ink on large sheets of paper. Bennett leaned over them, his eyes tracking the marked locations, the notes about game trails and water sources, the estimated patterns of the poachers' movements. His finger traced one particular route, and Flora saw understanding dawn in his expression. "You are right," he said quietly. "They are working a circuit. Hit one valley, move to the next, come back when the game populations recover. Efficient and sustainable from their perspective, which means they plan to keep operating here indefinitely." "Unless we stop them," Flora said. She stood close enough to Bennett that she could smell horse and leather and something else, maybe sage from riding through the scrubland. It was not unpleasant, and she found herself very aware of his presence in her small kitchen. Bennett looked up from the maps, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Flora felt something pass between them, some wordless recognition that went beyond their shared mission. Then Bennett cleared his throat and looked back at the maps. "Based on their pattern, they should hit this valley next," he said, pointing to a location 15 miles northeast. "Crooked Pine Basin. Good elk habitat, remote enough that they can work without interruption." "When?" Flora asked, forcing herself to focus. 3 days, maybe 4. "That gives us time to scout the location and set up an ambush. We will need supplies for at least a week in the field, and I will need to send a telegraph to my supervisor in San Francisco. Let him know what we are planning." Flora nodded, already making mental lists. "I can have everything ready by tomorrow morning. We can ride to Sacramento together, send your telegraph, and be in position by tomorrow night." Bennett studied her face, and Flora got the impression he was seeing her properly for the first time, not just as a source of information but as a person. "You have been alone out here for 2 years?" he asked. "Yes," Flora said simply. "My father had no other family and neither do I. When he died, the ranch became my responsibility." "That is a hard life for anyone, let alone a young woman on her own." Flora bristled slightly at that. "I am capable of managing hard things, Marshal. I have proven that today, I think." Bennett raised his hands in a peaceable gesture. "I meant no disrespect. I am impressed, actually. Most people would have given up or moved back to town where it was safer." The tension in Flora's shoulders eased. "This land is worth fighting for," she said. "My father taught me that some things have value beyond money or convenience. The wilderness is one of those things." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," Bennett said, and the gentleness in his voice made Flora's throat tighten unexpectedly. "He was," she managed. "I miss him every day." They worked together through the afternoon, refining their plans and discussing tactics. Bennett had a military background. Flora learned 5 years in the cavalry before he became a marshal, and his strategic thinking impressed her. He listened to her observations about the poachers' habits and incorporated her knowledge of the terrain into every decision. It felt strange and wonderful to have a partner after so many months of solitary struggle, and Flora caught herself watching the way Bennett's hands moved across the maps, the way his brow furrowed when he concentrated, the rare smile that transformed his serious face into something unexpectedly warm. As the sun began to set, Flora realized she had not offered Bennett any hospitality beyond spreading maps on her table. "You must be hungry," she said, feeling embarrassed. "I can make supper if you are planning to stay. The guest room is small, but the bed is comfortable." Bennett looked surprised, then pleased. "That is generous of you, Flora. I accept, if you are certain it is no trouble." "It is no trouble at all," Flora assured him. "Honestly, it will be nice to cook for someone besides myself for a change." She made venison stew with vegetables from her garden, and they ate at the kitchen table as darkness fell outside. Bennett complimented her cooking sincerely, and they talked about things beyond Poachers and plans. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about joining the Army at 18 to escape a father who drank too much, about finding purpose in protecting people who could not protect themselves. Flora told him about her childhood following her father through the wilderness, learning to track and hunt and read the land like other girls learned embroidery and music. They were both outsiders in their own ways, people who did not quite fit the mold society expected, and Flora felt a kinship growing that went deeper than their temporary alliance. After supper, Bennett insisted on helping with the dishes, working beside her at the wash basin with an easy competence that suggested he was accustomed to taking care of himself. Their hands brushed once as they reached for the same pot, and Flora felt a jolt of something electric pass between them. She glanced at Bennett and saw color rising in his cheeks, confirmation that he had felt it too. "Thank you for trusting me," he said quietly, drying the pot with more attention than it required. "I know you have been fighting alone for a long time. It takes courage to accept help." "I am just glad you arrived when you did," Flora replied. "Another few minutes and I would have been in serious trouble." Bennett set the pot down and turned to face her fully. "I meant what I said earlier. You are doing something important here, Flora. Something most people would not have the strength or conviction to do. Your father would be proud of you." The words hit Flora with unexpected force, and she felt tears prick her eyes. She had not cried when her father died, had not let herself break down during the long, hard months that followed, but Bennett's simple statement of recognition cracked something open inside her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, and her voice shook slightly. "That means more than you know." Bennett's hand moved as if to touch her shoulder, then stopped, hanging awkwardly in the space between them. Flora made the decision for him, stepping forward and letting herself lean into his solid warmth for just a moment. His arms came around her carefully, offering comfort without demands, and Flora let herself take it, let herself feel the relief of not being alone. They stood that way for a long moment, and then Flora stepped back, wiping her eyes quickly. "I am sorry," she said. "I do not usually fall apart like that." "You did not fall apart," Bennett said gently. "You are human, that is all. There is no shame in that." Flora managed a shaky smile. "You are very kind, Marshal Kane." "Bennett," he corrected, and the warmth in his gray eyes made Flora's heart beat a little faster. They rode to Sacramento the next morning, arriving in town around mid-morning. The telegraph office was busy, and while Bennett sent his message to San Francisco, Flora purchased additional supplies at the general store. She saw several people she knew, and their curious glances at her, and Bennett did not escape her notice. Sacramento was small enough that gossip traveled fast, and Flora knew that by evening, half the town would be speculating about the handsome marshal staying at her ranch. Let them talk, she thought with a flash of defiance. She had stopped caring about Sacramento's opinions long ago, when the town made it clear they would not help her fight the poachers. If they wanted to create scandal out of practical necessity, that was their problem, not hers. Bennett emerged from the telegraph office looking satisfied. "Message sent. My supervisor will coordinate with the local authorities once we have the poachers in custody." They loaded the supplies onto their horses and rode back toward the ranch, but instead of stopping there, they continued northeast into the high country. The terrain grew rougher as they climbed, pine forests giving way to rocky slopes dotted with juniper and sage. They made camp that night in a sheltered canyon, building a small fire and eating jerked beef with hard biscuits. The stars overhead were brilliant in the clear mountain air, and Flora lay in her bedroll listening to the sounds of the wilderness she loved, feeling more content than she had in months. Across the fire, Bennett was a dark shape wrapped in his own blankets, and Flora wondered if he was asleep or lying awake like her. As if sensing her attention, he spoke into the darkness. "Flora, can I ask you something?" "Of course," she said. "You ever get lonely out here? Living alone, fighting battles nobody else seems to care about?" Flora considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I get more lonely in town, surrounded by people who do not understand why this matters. At least out here, the solitude is honest." She heard Bennett shift position. "I understand that. I have spent most of my adult life traveling, never staying anywhere long enough to build real connections. It is lonely, but it is also simpler. No complications, no expectations." "Is that what you want?" Flora asked. "Simplicity?" There was a long pause. "I used to think so," Bennett said finally. "Lately, I am not so sure." Flora wanted to ask what he meant, but sleep was pulling at her and the words seemed too important to rush. She let her eyes close, and her last conscious thought was that having Bennett nearby made the darkness feel less vast. They reached Crooked Pine Basin the next afternoon and spent hours scouting the area, identifying the best positions for an ambush. The basin was exactly as Flora had predicted. A sheltered valley with a creek running through it and elk sign everywhere. If the poachers followed their pattern, they would arrive within the next 2 days, and Flora and Bennett would be waiting. They made a cold camp that night, no fire to give away their position, and took turns keeping watch. During Flora's shift, she sat on a rocky outcrop overlooking the basin and thought about how much her life had changed in just 2 days. She had been so certain she would have to fight alone forever, had almost resigned herself to eventual defeat, and then Bennett had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not known how to voice. She thought about the way he listened when she spoke, the respect in his eyes when he looked at her maps, the gentle strength of his arms when he held her in her kitchen. Flora had never paid much attention to men, too busy with survival and mission to consider romance, but Bennett was different. He saw her as an equal, a partner, and that made all the difference. The poachers arrived on the 3rd day, just as Bennett had predicted. Flora spotted them from her hidden position on the ridge. 4 men with a string of pack mules, moving into the basin with the arrogant confidence of people who thought they owned the wilderness. She signaled Bennett, who was positioned on the opposite side of the basin, and they waited until the poachers had dismounted and begun setting up their camp. Then Bennett stood up, rifle leveled, his marshal's badge catching the afternoon sun. "Federal Marshal," he called out, his voice echoing off the valley walls. "You are under arrest for poaching and murder. Surrender your weapons and you will be treated fairly." The poachers froze, then scattered, reaching for their guns. Flora fired a warning shot over their heads, and they realized they were surrounded. One of them, a big man with a scarred face, raised his rifle toward Bennett, and Flora did not hesitate. She aimed for his shoulder and squeezed the trigger, and the man went down with a cry of pain, his weapon spinning away into the grass. The fight was brief and decisive. Faced with 2 skilled shooters in superior positions, the poachers surrendered quickly, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. Bennett kept them covered while Flora descended from the ridge, and together they bound the men's hands with rope and secured their weapons. "You have no authority here," the scarred man spat, clutching his wounded shoulder. "This is open land." "Wrong," Bennett said calmly. "Federal marshals have jurisdiction over crimes committed on public lands, which includes poaching and murder. You will stand trial in San Francisco, and I have enough evidence to see you all hanged." The scarred man's face went pale, and he said nothing more. They marched the prisoners back toward Sacramento, a 2-day journey made longer by the need to stay alert for escape attempts. None came. The poachers seemed to understand they had finally been caught, and the fight had gone out of them. Flora rode beside Bennett, and they talked quietly about what would happen next. Bennett would need to transport the prisoners to San Francisco and testify at their trial, a process that would take weeks at minimum. "What will you do after?" Flora asked as they made camp on their final night before reaching town. Bennett poked at the fire with a stick, his expression thoughtful. "I am not sure. I have been a marshal for 5 years now, and I am starting to wonder if there might be something else I should be doing with my life." "Like what?" Flora asked, though her heart was beating faster, hope and fear tangled together in her chest. "Something that lets me stay in one place," Bennett said slowly. "Something that matters in a lasting way, not just catching criminals and moving on to the next case." He looked up at her, and the firelight reflected in his gray eyes. "I have been thinking about what you said, about some things having value beyond money or convenience. I think maybe I have been looking for that kind of value my whole life without knowing it." Flora felt warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "The wilderness needs protecting," she said carefully. "One person can only do so much, but 2 people working together could accomplish a lot more." Bennett's expression shifted into something Flora could not quite read. "Are you offering me a job, Flora Vance?" "Maybe," Flora said, feeling bold. "Or maybe I am offering you a reason to stay." The space between them felt charged with possibility, and Flora saw Bennett's throat work as he swallowed. "I would need to resign my position," he said. "Talk to my supervisor, make it official. That would take time." "I have time," Flora said softly. "I have been waiting my whole life for someone who understands what I am trying to do here. I can wait a little longer." Bennett moved around the fire to sit beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I need you to understand something," he said, his voice low and serious. "I am not good at putting down roots. I have spent years running from anything that felt permanent, and I am afraid I will disappoint you." Flora turned to face him fully, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I am not asking for promises you cannot keep, Bennett. I am asking if you want to try. That is all. Just try and see what happens." Bennett's hand came up to cup her face, his calloused thumb tracing her cheekbone with surprising gentleness. "I want to try," he said. "God help me, Flora, I want that more than I have wanted anything in years." When he kissed her, it was careful and questioning, giving Flora every opportunity to pull away. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, her hands gripping his shirt, kissing him back with all the lonely hope she had been carrying for so long. Bennett made a sound low in his throat and deepened the kiss, his arms coming around her and pulling her close. Flora felt the world narrow to just this moment, just the 2 of them and the fire and the vast wilderness spreading around them under the stars. They broke apart breathless, and Bennett rested his forehead against hers. "I am going to San Francisco," he said. "I will testify at the trial and resign my commission properly, and then I am coming back here to you if you will have me." "I will have you," Flora whispered. "Just come back, Bennett. That is all I ask." They delivered the prisoners to Sacramento the next morning and turned them over to the local sheriff, who looked simultaneously impressed and annoyed that Flora and Bennett had accomplished what he claimed was impossible. Bennett spent 2 hours writing reports and arranging for the prisoners' transport to San Francisco, and then he walked Flora back to where their horses were tied. "I will be gone a month, maybe 6 weeks at most," he said, taking both her hands in his. "Will you be all right here alone?" "I have been alone for 2 years," Flora reminded him. "I can manage another month. Besides, with the poachers gone, the wilderness will be safer than it has been in a long time." Bennett pulled her close, handing her something small and metal. Flora looked down and saw his marshal's badge resting in her palm. "Keep this for me," he said. "It will remind you that I am coming back." Flora closed her fingers around the badge, feeling its weight. "I do not need a reminder," she said, "but I will keep it safe anyway." They kissed one more time, there in the dusty street with half of Sacramento watching, and Flora did not care who saw or what they thought. When Bennett finally rode away toward the south, heading for San Francisco, Flora stood watching until he disappeared around a bend in the road. Then she tucked the badge into her shirt pocket, mounted her horse, and rode back to her ranch with her heart feeling fuller than it had in years. The month that followed was the longest of Flora's life. She threw herself into work, repairing fences and preparing the ranch for winter, but every day felt like an eternity. She took long rides through the valleys where she had fought the poachers, documenting the recovery of the game populations and making notes about which areas needed the most protection. The wilderness was healing without the constant pressure of illegal hunting, and Flora felt proud of what they had accomplished, but the victory felt hollow without Bennett there to share it. She received one letter from him, posted from San Francisco, telling her that the trial was proceeding and that his resignation had been accepted. He wrote about missing the mountains and missing her, and Flora read the letter so many times she nearly wore the paper thin. She wrote back, telling him about the ranch and the wilderness and how much she looked forward to his return, but she did not know if her letter would reach him before he started the journey back to Sacramento. 6 weeks after Bennett left, Flora was working in the barn when she heard hoofbeats coming up the valley road. She stepped outside, shading her eyes against the October sun, and saw a lone rider approaching. Her heart kicked hard against her ribs, and she started walking, then running, meeting Bennett halfway between the barn and the road. He swung down from his horse and caught her as she threw herself into his arms, spinning her once before setting her down and kissing her so thoroughly that Flora forgot how to breathe. "I am back," he said unnecessarily, grinning down at her with such joy that Flora felt tears spring to her eyes. "I am back and I am staying if you will still have me. Always," Flora said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Always, Bennett Kane." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her. Flora opened it and saw an official document from the Federal Marshal's office, confirming Bennett's resignation and commending him for exceptional service. Clipped to it was another paper, this one from the California state government, appointing Bennett Kane as an official wilderness ranger for the Sacramento region, with authority to protect public lands and enforce hunting regulations. "I talked to some people in San Francisco," Bennett explained. "Told them about what you have been doing here, about the need for someone to protect the wilderness permanently. They created this position specifically for me, Flora. It does not pay much, but it is legal authority to do the work you have been doing alone." Flora looked up at him, overwhelmed. "You did this for me." "I did this for us," Bennett corrected. "I told you I wanted something that mattered in a lasting way. This is it. You are it." He took a deep breath, and Flora saw nervousness flicker across his face for the first time. "I also talked to a minister in San Francisco. He gave me this." Bennett pulled another paper from his pocket, and Flora saw it was a marriage license, blank but official. "I know this is fast," Bennett said in a rush. "I know we have only known each other for 2 months, and if you want to wait, I will understand. But Flora, I am 30 years old, and I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You are strong and brave and dedicated to something bigger than yourself, and I want to spend the rest of my life working beside you, protecting the things we both believe in." Flora felt like her chest might burst. "Are you asking me to marry you, Bennett Kane?" "Yes," he said simply. "I am asking you to marry me, Flora Vance. Will you?" Flora threw her arms around his neck and kissed him hard. "Yes," she said against his mouth. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married a week later in Sacramento, with the minister Bennett had contacted performing the ceremony in the small church at the edge of town. Flora wore the one good dress she owned, pale blue cotton that had been her mother's, and Bennett wore a new suit he purchased specially for the occasion. There were no guests except the sheriff and his wife, who served as witnesses, but Flora did not care. All that mattered was Bennett's face as he said his vows, the absolute certainty in his voice when he promised to love and protect her for the rest of his life. They spent their wedding night at the ranch, and Flora learned that Bennett was as gentle and attentive in private as he was in everything else. He made love to her slowly, carefully, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and Flora fell asleep in his arms feeling like she had finally found the home she had been searching for without knowing it. The years that followed were the happiest of Flora's life. Bennett took his new position seriously, working with Flora to establish protected areas and educate hunters about sustainable practices. They built a second cabin near Crooked Pine Basin that served as a ranger station, spending weeks at a time in the high country during the summer months, monitoring wildlife and preventing poaching before it could start. In the winters, they returned to the ranch, and Bennett helped Flora expand her father's dream, adding more land and establishing connections with other conservationists throughout California. Their first child arrived in the autumn of 1883, a healthy boy they named Thomas after Flora's father. Bennett was terrified of fatherhood at first, worried he would repeat his own father's mistakes, but Flora watched him hold their son with such tenderness that she knew those fears were groundless. Thomas grew up strong and curious, following his parents through the wilderness as Flora had once followed her father, learning to love and protect the land. 2 years later, they had a daughter, Sarah, who had her father's gray eyes and her mother's determination. She was fearless from birth, climbing trees before she could properly walk and demanding to go on patrols with her parents from the moment she could ride a horse. Flora and Bennett laughed about having raised a tiny warrior, but they were secretly proud of her spirit. The work was never easy. There were always new threats to fight, new poachers to catch, new battles to wage with commercial interests who saw the wilderness as nothing but profit waiting to be extracted. But Flora and Bennett faced every challenge together, their partnership growing stronger with each passing year. They built a life of purpose and meaning, rooted in the land they loved, and the conviction that some things were worth fighting for no matter the cost. In the spring of 1889, 8 years after Bennett first rode into Flora's life, they stood together on the ridge above Crooked Pine Basin, watching their children play in the meadow below. Thomas was 6 now, teaching 5-year-old Sarah how to identify animal tracks, and Flora felt a profound sense of contentment watching them. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Bennett, leaning against his side. "Giving up the Marshal Service, settling down here instead of traveling?" Bennett wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close. "Not for a single moment," he said. "You gave me something I did not know I needed, Flora, a purpose, a home, a family. You gave me a reason to stay." Flora smiled and turned to kiss him, soft and sweet. "You gave me the same thing," she said. "I thought I would have to fight alone forever. You changed that when you arrived here. You changed everything." They stood together in the warm spring sunshine, watching their children and the wilderness spreading endlessly in all directions, and Flora knew that this was what victory looked like. Not a single dramatic moment, but years of steady dedication, building something lasting with the person you loved. The poachers were gone, the wilderness was protected, and the work her father started would continue through her children and their children after them. Bennett kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for taking a chance on a wandering marshal," he said quietly. "Thank you for being brave enough to stay," Flora replied. Below them, Thomas let out a whoop of excitement, pointing at something in the grass, and Sarah ran to see what he had found. Their laughter carried on the wind, bright and joyful, and Flora thought about all the moments that had led to this one. The lonely years, the desperate fights, the day Bennett rode into her life and everything changed. It had all been worth it, every struggle and sacrifice, because it had brought her here, to this perfect moment with the man she loved and the family they had built together. As the sun climbed higher, turning the valley golden, Flora and Bennett walked hand in hand down the slope to join their children. There would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight and more ground to defend, but they would face it all together, just as they had promised on their wedding day. The wilderness stretched around them, wild and beautiful and free, and Flora knew that as long as she and Bennett stood together, it would remain that way for generations to come. Their story was not one of sudden transformation or fairy tale magic. It was something better, something real. Two people who found each other at exactly the right moment, who chose to build a life of meaning and purpose, who proved that love was not just about feeling but about action, about showing up every day and doing the hard work side by side. They had started as allies, fighting a common enemy, and had become partners in every sense of the word. Their lives so intertwined that Flora could no longer imagine existing without Bennett's steady presence beside her. The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and growth. Thomas and Sarah grew into capable young people who carried their parents' values into a changing world. Bennett's position as a wilderness ranger became a model that other states adopted. And by the time the new century arrived, the idea of protecting public lands had gained traction throughout the Western territories. Flora and Bennett could not take credit for all of it, but they knew they had played their part, had planted seeds that grew into something larger than themselves. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Bennett took Flora back to the granite outcropping where they had first met, where he had ridden to her rescue and changed the course of both their lives. They sat together watching the sunset, their hands clasped, and Flora thought about how strange and wonderful it was that a single moment could alter everything. If Bennett had arrived 5 minutes later, if she had taken a different path that morning, if any of 1,000 small details had been different, they might never have found each other. "What are you thinking about?" Bennett asked, and Flora realized she had been quiet for a long time. "Fate," she said. "Whether things happen for a reason or if we just make the best of whatever comes our way." Bennett considered this, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "I think maybe it is both," he said finally. "I think life puts us in certain places at certain times, and then we have to decide what to do with those moments. I could have ridden past that morning, could have decided your fight with the Poachers was not my concern. But I did not, and that choice made all the difference." "I could have been too proud to accept your help," Flora said. "I almost was, actually. I had been alone so long that partnership felt dangerous, like it might mean I had failed." "But you did not refuse," Bennett said. "You took a chance, and look what we built because of it." Flora leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beating of his heart. "I love you," she said simply. "I have loved you since the moment you stood up to those poachers, but I think I love you more now than I did then. Is that possible?" "It is more than possible," Bennett said, his voice rough with emotion. "It is everything. You are everything to me, Flora." They kissed as the sun sank below the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold, and Flora felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible during those lonely years before Bennett. She had thought she was fighting for the wilderness, for her father's memory, for some abstract principle of conservation. But really, she had been fighting to become the person who could recognize love when it finally arrived, who could be brave enough to accept it and build something lasting from it. The ride back to the ranch was slow and easy, both of them reluctant to let the evening end. Thomas and Sarah were staying with friends in Sacramento for the night, giving their parents rare time alone, and Flora found herself grateful for the solitude. She loved her children fiercely, but there was something precious about these moments with just Bennett, reminders of who they had been before parenthood complicated everything. That night, they lay together in their bed with the windows open to let in the cool evening air, and Bennett traced the lines of Flora's face with gentle fingers. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" he asked. "When I asked if you got lonely." "I said I got more lonely in town than I did in the wilderness," Flora replied. "That the solitude out here was honest." "I think about that sometimes," Bennett said. "About how we were both so used to being alone that we had almost convinced ourselves we preferred it. And then we found each other and realized that partnership did not mean losing yourself. It meant becoming more yourself, just with someone beside you." Flora felt tears prick her eyes, moved by the truth of his words. "You have made me better," she whispered. "Stronger and braver and more hopeful. I did not think I could be any of those things after my father died, but you showed me I was wrong." "We made each other better," Bennett corrected, pulling her close. "That is what love does, Flora. It does not complete you like you are broken. It amplifies you, makes you more of what you already are." They made love slowly, tenderly, with the kind of intimacy that came from years of knowing each other's bodies and hearts. Afterward, Flora lay in Bennett's arms and listened to his breathing slow as he drifted toward sleep, and she thought about how perfectly ordinary their life had become. There were no more dramatic rescues or shootouts with poachers, just the daily work of conservation and the quiet joys of family and partnership. It was exactly what she had needed without knowing it, this peaceful life built on solid ground. The seasons turned and their children grew, and Flora and Bennett grew older together, their bodies marked by time and hard work, but their connection only deepening. They watched as Thomas married a teacher from Sacramento and started his own family, as Sarah became a ranger like her father and pushed even further into the wilderness to establish new protected areas. They became grandparents, welcoming 3 grandchildren who learned to love the land just as they had, ensuring that the work would continue long after Flora and Bennett were gone. On a summer evening in 1905, when Flora was 48 and Bennett was 55, they sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Bennett's hair had gone silver, and Flora's braids showed threads of gray, but they still held hands like newlyweds, still found reasons to smile at each other across rooms. 24 years, Flora said, counting back to that first morning when Bennett rode to her rescue. "It does not feel that long, does it? It feels like yesterday and forever at the same time," Bennett replied. "Time is strange like that when you are happy." Flora squeezed his hand. "Are you happy, Bennett, truly?" He turned to look at her, and the love in his eyes was as clear and strong as it had been on their wedding day. "I am happier than I ever imagined possible," he said. "You gave me a home, Flora, not just a place to live, but a purpose and a family and a reason to wake up grateful every morning." "How could I be anything but happy?" "Good," Flora said, smiling. "Because you gave me the same thing, and I want you to know that. Every single day I thank whatever force of the universe brought you to me when I needed you most." They sat in comfortable silence as the darkness gathered, watching stars emerge one by one in the vast California sky. Somewhere in the valleys beyond their ranch, elk were bedding down for the night, and mountain lions were beginning their hunts, and all the complex, beautiful machinery of the wilderness was turning according to patterns older than human memory. Flora and Bennett had spent their lives protecting that wilderness, fighting to ensure it would endure, and they had succeeded beyond her father's wildest dreams. But more than that, they had found each other. They had built a partnership based on respect and shared purpose and deep, abiding love. They had raised children who carried those values forward, who would fight the same battles in their own time. They had created something lasting, not just in the protected valleys and forests, but in the family and legacy they would leave behind. As the night deepened and the chill drove them inside, Bennett pulled Flora close and kissed her forehead. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" Flora asked, though she thought she knew. "For being brave enough to let me stay," Bennett said. "For taking a chance on a wandering marshal who did not know what he was looking for until he found you." Flora smiled and led him inside, into the warm glow of their home, into the life they had built together from nothing but determination and love. "Always," she said, the same word she had spoken on the day he returned from San Francisco, the same promise that had sustained them through all the years since. "Always, Bennett Kane, for as long as we both live." And that was exactly what they did. They lived, fully and completely, making every day count, proving that love was not just a feeling but a choice you made over and over again. The poachers were long gone, scattered by justice or time, but the wilderness remained, protected and wild and free, a testament to two people who refused to give up, who found each other in the fight and built something beautiful from it. That was their legacy, written in the land they loved and the family they raised, enduring long after they were gone, proof that some battles were worth fighting and some people were worth staying for, no matter what.